Section 1 of Servants of Satan by Seabury Quinn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ben Tucker. Number 1. The Salem Horror. When the sightseeing bus from Boston carries tourists from the west and south through the crooked and historic streets of Salem, Massachusetts, the lecturer waves his megaphone toward a long, turtle-backed rise of land with the stereotyped announcement, "On your left, ladies and gentlemen, is the famous Gallows Hill where witches were hanged in the colonial days." Just that. A 19-word sentence. A craning of curious necks, a raising of perfunctorily interested eyes, and the cumbersome omnibus rumbles and bumps away on its homeward trip, leaving behind the monument of the most dreadful chapter in American history. A spot accursed to this day by the blood of innocent victims of fanaticism. A landmark bearing testimony to the terrible conflagration kindled by the effort of a bigoted, ignorant, self-righteous man to reassert his sway over the community and retain the pitiful salary of a parson in a small and none too thriving colonial church. Let us push back the hands of the clock 2.5 centuries. Salem Village, small, but even now prosperous, clings to the rocky promontory jutting Europeward into the Atlantic Ocean. A few substantial houses of clapboard, fewer mansions of brick, brought as ballast in ships from England, and a foursquare white-doored church. 4 men, heavily cloaked against the shrewish October wind, stride determinedly through the narrow, unpaved street, talking earnestly. They are Joseph Parker, Joseph Hutchinson, Joseph Putnam, and Daniel Andrews, all freeholders in Salem Village, appointed at a recent town meeting to consider ways and means for adjusting the controversy raging between the Reverend Samuel Parris, pastor of Salem Village Church, and his congregation. 2 years before, the Reverend Mr. Parris was called to the pulpit of Salem Village Church in an effort to heal the dissension cleaving the congregation. In settling in his position, the reverend gentleman drove a hard bargain with his people, extracting in pay the last brass farthing the congregation could raise. Since his installation, he had intrigued continually for greater power in the community. Failing to secure a deed to the parsonage property in his own name, he had set one faction of the congregation against the other, taking sides first with one side, then the other, till the little band of worshippers is torn to pieces with factional strife. From the window of his study in the manse, Mr. Parris sees the 4 select men striding down the street, and his sallow face reflects the misgivings his heart feels. These men, substantial citizens all, are not to be browbeaten or bullied by any clergyman, no matter how thunderous his words or violent his temper. They will surely suggest the emptying of his pulpit as the only means of settling the controversy. Something must be done. A means must be found to unite the people in one common cause and divert their dislike from their pastor. Love? No. The Reverend Mr. Parris's religion knows no love. He is a fundamentalist of the fundamentalists, and like his modern brethren of the same school, finds his favorite passages of Scripture among those which tell of the dreadful vengeance of the Almighty. Fear? Hatred? Perhaps. Those emotions sway men and women more vigorously than anything else. But how? How? The reverend gentleman takes up his great cedar-bound Bible and opens it at random. Advice, if not comfort, is to be found in its pages. He reads intently by the waning afternoon sunshine, his long, crooked-nailed forefinger tracing the words as his eyes devour line after line. The 27th verse of the 20th chapter of the book of Leviticus. And a man also, or a woman that hath a familiar spirit, or that is a wizard, shall surely be put to death. Their blood shall be upon them. Mr. Parris closes the holy book and paces his study floor, his head bent, his lean, knotty fingers locked behind his back. He meditates the text he had just read. Their blood shall be upon them. Among other household effects, the Reverend Mr. Parris owned 2 servants, John Indian, a partially civilized American aborigine, and Tituba, a half-breed woman from the West Indies, part Indian, part Negro. Like most West Indian slaves, this woman laid claim to a knowledge of voodooism or obeah, pretending to tell fortunes by palmistry and foretell the future by divination and communion with the spirits of the dead. Such things were roundly denounced and heavily penalized by the laws of the colony, which makes what followed doubly hard to explain. During the winter of 1691 and 92, a circle of young girls and women began meeting at the Reverend Mr. Parris's home for the purpose of consulting Tituba and learning the secrets of palmistry and fortune-telling. Those engaged in the forbidden pastime were Elizabeth Parris, age 9, Abigail Williams, 17, Anne Putnam, 12, Mary Walcott, 17, Elizabeth Hubbard, 17, Susanna Sheldon, 18, Elizabeth Booth, 18, Sarah Churchill, 20, and several others in their late teens or early 20s. Mr. Parris could not have been unaware of these gatherings or of their purpose, for two of the young women, Elizabeth Parris and Abigail Williams, were members of his immediate family, and all the seances were held in his kitchen. Nevertheless, it does not appear that he forbade Tituba to teach the black arts to members of his family and flock, or denounced the unlawful assemblies to the authorities. On the contrary, he seems to have exhibited a mildness and tolerance entirely at variance with his usual habit and the custom of the times and community. Winter ran its course, and springtime came, and with it a remarkable sequel to the meetings at Mr. Parris's house. The girls and women who had studied with Tituba began behaving in a most unaccountable manner. Some of them would creep under chairs, tables, or benches. Others uttered strange and unintelligible words and cries. Still others indulged in spasms and fainting fits, choosing the most public places to display their seizures. Simple home remedies failing to relieve the children's strange illness, the village physician, a Dr. Griggs, was called in, and after making an exhaustive examination of the patients, gave it as his opinion that they were bewitched. This was quite in accordance with medical ethics of the times, which permitted physicians to make the devil the excuse for their own inability to diagnose a case or effect a cure. The devil was no laughingstock in the 17th century. He was a very real and personal fiend, devoutly believed in by all who called themselves Christians, and was ever on the watch for some unwary soul. All the world was a sector on which the forces of good and evil contended unremittingly, and just as God chose his ministers, so the devil chose his to further his work among men. Holy Scripture declared there were such things as witches, and it was man's bounden duty, as a good follower of the church, to kill off this wicked brood wherever found. So it was in Salem village in 1692, and the doctor's announcement of witchcraft set the superstitious people afire. The afflicted children, differing not at all from children today, proceeded to make the most of their position in the public eye, and acted more outlandishly than before. Abigail Williams, Mr. Parris's own niece, rose in church one Sunday morning and shouted to her uncle, "Now stand up and name thy text!" All eyes were turned on her in horrified amazement, but Mr. Parris, who had never before been known to let a slight to his ministerial dignity go unrebuked, looked mildly at her, and announced his sermon would be based on the 18th verse of the 22nd chapter of the book of Exodus. "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." Sermons in those days were not gauged by the minute hand of the preacher's watch, but by the sands of an hourglass on the pulpit rail, and it was not till the glass had been twice reversed that Mr. Parris concluded his impassioned harangue. He traced the abominable crime of witchcraft from biblical days to the founding of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, ever reverting to his text and urging the congregation to perform their religious duty and put all witches to death. At the conclusion of his discourse, the little church was filled with an hysterical mob, ready to turn upon any suspected person and execute him on the spot. And the excitement was raised to fever pitch when one of the bewitched girls suddenly rose to her feet and cried, "Look where she sits upon the beam!" Who? asked the congregation excitedly, for they, of course, saw no one seated on the ceiling beams. Another girl, also eager to be noticed, rose with a wild shriek and exclaimed, "There is a yellow bird sitting on the minister's hat!" "Where? Where?" the bewildered people cried, for the yellow bird was, naturally, as invisible to them as the witch on the crossbeams. When meeting was over, the children's parents pressed them to name the wicked persons who had bewitched them. But here the girls became vague, contenting themselves with rolling their eyes, uttering terrified cries and pointing distractedly at terrible sights visible only to themselves. The afflicted children were hurried to the parsonage, where their parents besought Mr. Parris to pray for them. Dismissing the elders, the minister locked himself in his study with the bewitched persons. At the end of an hour, he opened the door and announced the children had accused Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne as the witches who had cast the spell upon them. Sarah Good was a poor, friendless old woman, subsisting largely on the charity of her neighbors. Sarah Osborne was nearing 80 years of age and had been confined to bed by a lingering illness for several weeks. Both of these hapless creatures were dragged to the church, where a tribunal of clergymen, hastily summoned by Mr. Parris, bullied and hectored them for hours on end. No third degree imposed by modern police ever approached the methods employed by these godly men in attempting to extort confessions from two distracted and friendless old women. But the prisoners stood firm in maintaining their innocence. Then it was that Mr. Parris took counsel with the bewitched girls again, exhorting them to name some other witch responsible for their agony. Soon he returned with the scandalous intelligence that Tituba, his own slave, had been denounced by the afflicted children. Tituba was haled before the meeting, but her terror was so great that no intelligent answers could be extracted from her. She was paroled in the custody of her master, who promised his reverend colleagues he would reason with her and impress her with the error of her ways. Years later, when she had been sold to another master, Tituba, then an old woman, told of the terrible beatings administered by her reverend owner, beatings merciless and unceasing, until she willingly agreed to confess herself a witch and implicate Goody Osborne and Goody Good in her confession. Before a court composed of John Haythorne and Jonathan Corwin, the two leading magistrates of the neighborhood, assisted by Mr. Parris and several other eminent divines, Tituba gave her testimony. The devil, she said, had appeared to her and asked her to serve him. She agreed to do his bidding and was told to attend a witches' meeting in a nearby wood. Together with Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, she had mounted a wagon pole and had been whisked through the air with the speed of the wind. In the heart of a deep, dark grove, the location of which she was unable to give, the devil awaited them in the form of a huge black man with one eye in the center of his forehead. She and the other two women had signed their names in his book with a pen dipped in their own blood, kissed him on an unusual part of his anatomy, and acknowledged themselves his servants forevermore. All this time the afflicted children had been keeping up an incessant noise, screaming, groaning, and writhing on the floor. When Goody Osborne's poor old hands twitched with nervousness, the children declared they suffered agonies, for she was pinching them. When Sarah Good brought her toothless gums together in senile terror, the shameless little wretches shrieked out that they were being bitten. Poor bedridden Sarah Osborne showed conclusively that she could not have attended any such meeting as that described by Tituba, for she had been confined to her home with illness at the time she was supposed to be attending the assignation. That, the court decided, was all the more proof of her witchcraft. Only a witch could be in two places at once. And since Tituba had testified Sarah Osborne was present at the meeting with the devil, and Sarah Osborne had shown she was home in bed at that very time, why, forsooth, she was in both spots at the same moment, and therefore more undoubtedly a witch than ever. Tituba, Sarah Osborne, and Sarah Good were sent to Ipswich jail as convicted witches, there to lie awaiting the hangman's convenience. Exposure and the weight of the heavy iron fetters riveted on her wrists and ankles proved too much for Mrs. Osborne. She died in jail. Tituba, because she had confessed, and especially because she had made the other two women's conviction possible, was granted a pardon and sent to Boston to be sold as a slave, where it was supposed she would fall into the hands of an owner who would take her and her power for working evil far away from Salem village. Perhaps the fact that her removal would prevent her babblings from connecting the Reverend Mr. Parris with the inception of the witchcraft prosecutions might have had some weight. Sarah Good lived to mount the gallows. As she stood with the rope about her throat, a clergyman said, "Thou art a wicked witch." "You are a liar," replied the old woman with spirit. "I am no more a witch than you are, and if you take my life, God will give you blood to drink." The second of Seabury Quinn's true tales of witchcraft will describe the accusations of evil made by our Puritan ancestors against Giles and Martha Corey, whose memory has been preserved in Longfellow's poem drama. The spectacular death of the stubborn wizard Giles Corey beneath a beam and the hanging of his wife Martha on Gallows Hill belong to the darkest period of America's history. In Weird Tales next month, on sale at all newsstands March 1st. End of Number 1, The Salem Horror. Section 2 of Servants of Satan by Seabury Quinn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Number 2, Giles and Martha Corey. The bleak March wind rushed pell-mell through the narrow, unpaved roadways of Salem village. It tore at tradesmen's signboards with a bellow. It rapped with frozen fingers at the dwelling's tight-barred shutters, then fled with a whoop of maniacal laughter past Salem Village Church to scream and howl round the Putnam homestead like a chained wolf straining at his leash. In an upper room of the strong, weather-stained house, a girl woke with an uneasy whimper and looked into the darkness of her low-ceilinged bedroom with round, fearful eyes listening to the screeching of the midnight wind. A moment she lay thus, then sat bolt upright, her mouth squared in a cry of mortal terror. "Anne, child, what ails thee?" Goodman Putnam swung back the door of his daughter's chamber and flashed the subdued light of his lantern about the room. "Oh, father," the girl, she was only 12 years old, cried. "The witch-woman, the wicked witch-woman was here." "Nonsense, child," her father answered testily. "Thou knowest the witches are in Ipswich jail. How can they plague thee now?" "Nathless, father," Anne Putnam replied stubbornly. "The witch was here but a moment agone. I saw her come down the chimney astride her broom-handle, looking at me with great red eyes." Goodman Putnam drew his flannel bedgown more tightly about his shoulders and looked fearfully at the fireplace his daughter's shaking forefinger indicated. "Didst thou recognize her, child?" he asked. I think," the girl stammered, trying to summon her memory. "I think 'twas Goodwife Corey, father." "Martha Corey, didst say?" Putnam answered thoughtfully. He laid a poker across the yawning mouth of the fireplace, for witches were notoriously afraid of iron, since that was the metal which bound our Lord to the tree, and patted his daughter reassuringly on the shoulder. "Peace, child," he counseled. "Thou'lt be safe till daylight. I'll see the parson about this in the morning." Next day a conference was held in the parsonage of Salem Village Church. The Reverend Samuel Parris, pastor of the congregation, Edward Putnam, and Ezekiel Cheever talked earnestly of the state of affairs. But 12 days ago Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, both old women of Salem Village, and Tituba, the half-breed Indian slave of Mr. Parris himself, had been remanded to jail as witches, there to await execution on the gallows. Anne Putnam and a number of other young girls and women had been their chief accusers, declaring Goody Good and Goody Osborne had grievously afflicted them with pains and torments. With the arrest and imprisonment of the witches, the good citizens of Salem had breathed a sigh of relief, for, though the devil was mighty, the Lord, aided by the Reverend Samuel Parris, and the Salem magistrates, was mightier, and righteousness had triumphed over wickedness. Now, alas, another witch had risen to plague the congregation. "Didst say 'twas Goodwife Corey?" the minister asked, interest, perhaps something more, in his deep-set eyes. "Aye," Putnam answered. "Goodwife Corey," the child said, "astride her broomstick." "This matter needs our service," Mr. Parris interrupted. My brethren, let us pray. Then you must away to Salem Farms to question this wretched woman. In Salem Farms, where the town of West Peabody now stands, was the substantial farmhouse of Giles Corey, husbandman. Corey was past his 80th birthday, but a better man in strength and endurance than many only half his age. Neighbors told wonderingly how he could cut a wider swath with the scythe than any man in the hayfield, how he had been known to lift a keg of cider to his mouth and drink from the bunghole as though from a mug, and how a drunken farmhand, relying on the old man's age to render him feeble, had paid for his folly with his life when he made a murderous assault on his employer. The laborer had attacked Corey with a flail, and the old man had defended himself so stoutly with his bare fists that the other subsequently died of the beating he received. Several of the neighbors had little cause to love Giles Corey. When some of them had wrongfully accused him of burning another's barn, he had an action for slander against them, and won substantial damages. Corey's wife Martha was his third spouse, and a fitting mate for him. Though past 60, she could turn out more work than any woman in the neighborhood, and the uniform perfection of her butter and constantly healthy condition of her chickens and geese were matters for envious conversation among other farmwives. Some there were who hinted darkly that her good luck came not alone from industry and the know-how, but might be attributed to the sort of help no Christian woman dare accept. Another cause the neighbors had to regard the Coreys askance was their attitude toward the arrests for witchcraft. When residents of the village and farms alike were crying out upon Goody Osborne and Goody Good, the Coreys stood aloof, Martha Corey declaring she would not convict a dog of egg-sucking on the testimony of hysterical children. As for Tituba, the minister's Indian slave, who had confessed herself a witch and implicated Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne with her, Goodwife Corey had hinted the Indian woman's pious master knew more about that confession than he cared to tell. And Putnam, the 12-year-old girl whose testimony, without cross-examination, had sworn away the lives of Mrs. Good and Mrs. Osborne, had heard Martha Corey declare she ought to have been soundly spanked, that she was a tale-inventing jade. Now, Ann Putnam had told her father it was Martha Corey who entered her bedchamber, astride a witch's broomstick. On the morning of March 12, 1692, Edward Putnam and Ezekiel Cheever rode into the barnyard of the Corey farmhouse and clamored on the kitchen door with their sword hilts. "I know why you come," Martha Corey said as she swung the door open and recognized her visitors. "You have come to say I am a witch, but I am none. I am a gospel woman." Putnam and Cheever looked knowingly at each other. How came this woman to know their errand before they had opened their lips? "You have been cried out against," Cheever told her solemnly. "The children of Salem village say you have appeared unto them." "And how did they say I was dressed?" the old lady interrupted. "Did they tell you what clothes I wore?" Here was a poser. No one had thought to ask Ann Putnam what clothes the witch wore when she appeared, but certainly she must have worn some. Puritans, even when they sold their souls to the devil and became witches, never appeared in public or private save fully dressed. Straight back to Salem village rose Ezekiel Cheever and Edward Putnam to question Anne regarding the witch's dress. When they arrived, they found the evil one's work had preceded them. Ann Putnam had talked with her friends and playmates. Now all were undergoing terrible agonies, crying out they were being cruelly pinched and bitten by some invisible person. Between times, they were crawling beneath chairs and tables, sticking out their tongues at fathers and mothers, and acting generally as no well-behaved Puritan children ever acted when not under the spell of some powerful witch or wizard. "What clothes wore the witch when she appeared last night?" Putnam asked the daughter. She, the girl strove to recall, then fell to sobbing bitterly. "I cannot tell," she wailed. "She was all wrapped round with a blaze of hellfire. I could not see her clothes." No one asked Ann Putnam how she knew the blaze to be that of hellfire, or how such fire differed from that commonly seen on the chimney hearth. The wicked witch's scheme was exposed. She had asked if the child could describe her clothes when she well knew her enveloping sheet of hellfire prevented her clothing from being seen. A warrant was forthwith issued for the arrest of Martha Corey, housewife of Salem Farms. The Pittmans had not perfected their shorthand system in 1692, and all court reporting which has come down to us from that time consists of abbreviated longhand notes. But the Reverend Samuel Parris, pastor of Salem Village Church, apparently added the duties of court reporter to those of assistant magistrate and prosecutor, since we have the following transcript of Martha Corey's examination preserved in his handwriting. By Magistrate John Hawthorne. Question. You are now in the hands of authority. Tell me now, why do you hurt these children? Answer. I do not. Question. Who doth? Answer. Pray give me leave to go and pray. This request was repeated several times. Question. We did not send for you to pray, but to tell why you hurt these children. Answer. I am an innocent person. I never had to do with witchcraft since I was born. I am a gospel woman. Question. How could you tell, then, that the child was bid to observe what clothes you wore when someone came to speak with you? Answer. I suspected it. Question. You dare thus to lie in all this assembly? I expect the truth. Speak now, and tell who told you what clothes. Answer. Nobody. At this point, one of the afflicted children suddenly cried out, Look, look! There stands a great black man beside her. He is whispering in her ear. Mr. Parris records this incident, but fails to give the name of the afflicted in his notes. Magistrate Hawthorne immediately asked the old lady what her invisible counselor said, and she replied, We must not believe all these distracted children say. Thereupon, to quote Mr. Parris's notes, there was extreme agony among all the afflicted. It was noted that when she bit her lip, again quoting the Reverend Scribe's report, several of the afflicted were bitten. The marshal said, She hath bit her lip, and immediately the afflicted were in uproar. In such circumstances, it is not surprising that Hawthorne and Corwin, the magistrates, should have found sufficient grounds for holding the old lady for the autumn assizes. She was accordingly lodged in jail till the court should convene in September. Her trial at the fall term of court presents little difference from similar hearings, save for one single incident. Among the afflicted was a young matron, a Mrs. Pope, wife of a well-to-do citizen of Salem. During the trial, this Christian young woman hurled her muff at the accused as she stood in the prison's dock. Her shot, as is often the way when women throw missiles, went wild, but if she lacked accuracy of aim, she certainly was not wanting in spirit. Stooping, she unfastened the buckle of her heavy, rough-weather brogan and flung it with all her might at Martha Corey. Practice had improved her marksmanship. The iron-studded heel of the heavy footgear struck the old lady full in the mouth. Tipstaves and court attendants made no move to interfere. With bruised and swollen lips, Martha Corey stood to receive sentence of death by hanging. Another entry in the Reverend Mr. Parris's notes furnishes us with the penultimate chapter of Martha Corey's tragedy. Accordingly, this 14th September, the three aforesaid brethren, Lieutenant Nathaniel Putnam and 2 deacons of Salem Village Church, went with the pastor to her in Salem prison, whom we found very obdurate, justifying herself, and condemning all that had done anything to her discovery or condemnation. Whereupon, after a little discourse, for her imperiousness would not suffer much, and after prayer, the dreadful sentence of excommunication was pronounced against her. 6 days after Martha Corey's arrest on a charge of witchcraft, her husband, Giles Corey, was haled before the magistrates on a similar accusation. The same afflicted children who had sworn away the wife's life appeared in the role of prosecuting witnesses against the husband, and so greatly did they suffer that, though the old man stood a good 10 yards from them, his hands were lashed behind his back to keep him from pinching the girls by magic. After the children's tale of hauntings, pinchings, beatings, and other abuses had been told, Giles Corey was permitted to speak in his own behalf, but when he declared himself innocent, the afflicted children forthwith fell to the floor, some in a dead faint, others writhing and groaning in agony. "Is it not enough to work magic at other times?" the magistrate Hawthorne asked the prisoner sternly as he beheld the sufferings of the afflicted. "Must you be at it in the face of authority?" Again the old man denied his guilt, and the magistrate interrupted with, "Why do you tell such unchristian lies against these witnesses?" Throughout the short hearing of Giles Corey's case, the afflicted seemed almost beside themselves. If he held his head on one side the better to hear the judge's words, The heads of the afflicted were all held on one side while they cried aloud that his magic compelled them to imitate his movements. He drew in his cheeks. Their cheeks instantly were drawn in. There was little testimony in his case. The cries and general demeanor of the childish accusers were enough to convince the magistrates they had a dangerous and powerful servant of Satan in custody. He was remanded to jail to await the grand jury's action. September 7th, 1692, Giles Corey was led into court to answer an indictment for witchcraft. The court clerk read the document and, as was customary, asked the defendant whether he pleaded guilty or not guilty. Corey, though past the allotted 70 years, was strong in spirit. "'Tis nonsense," he cried in a clear, ringing voice. "To peril a man's life on the idle tales of children is foolery. I'll not answer to such an indictment." Court and spectators sat aghast. Had not the witnesses on whose testimony Giles Corey was indicted been sworn on the Holy Scriptures? Did not those same Scriptures declare witches and wizards existed and must be put to death? Whoever called a trial for witchcraft foolery denied the Bible and mocked at God. This man was a blasphemer as well as a wizard. What to do? No man could be legally sentenced unless he had previously been found guilty by jury after a plea of not guilty, or had been saved the court's time by pleading guilty. The court took counsel upon the case, then decided to apply the terrible penalty of peine forte et dure. This was literally applying pressure to the accused, since it consisted of laying him on his back and piling upon his chest and abdomen as great a weight of timber, stone, or iron as he could bear, and more, till he either died or agreed to answer guilty or not guilty to the indictment charging him with crime. Footnote: while the terrible penalty of peine forte et dure was inflicted only once by a court in America, it was by no means unknown in England. Juliana Quick died by it in 1442. Anthony Arrowsmith suffered a like fate in 1598, as did Walter Calverley in 1605 and Major Strangeways in 1657. A similar case is recorded at the Cambridge Assizes as late as 1741, though the victim is unnamed. The punishment was abrogated by Act of Parliament in 1772. The English law differed from that of continental European nations in that it strictly forbade torture of accused or witnesses to make them testify. But an ancient statute dating to the reign of Henry IV permitted this form of torture for those who delayed justice by refusing to answer an indictment. It mattered not that the accused's conviction was a foregone conclusion. He must have his day in court, and judge and jury must indeed, go through the motions of according him a fair trial before sentence could be legally pronounced and executed. On Monday, September 19th, 1692, Giles Corey was taken to a spot near what was later to be the site of the Howard Street Burial Ground and Brown Street, Salem, laid on his back and buried under a great pile of timber and rocks. Puritan conscience battled Puritan conscience. The firmness of purpose which led the conscientious officers, blinded by the crude superstition they mistook for religion, to torture aged Giles Corey, was the same firmness of purpose which made the old man refuse to go through the farce of a trial for a crime he knew to be impossible. It was the same uncompromising spirit which had already wrested a new world from red-skinned men of the woods and would later hold it against red-coated men of the king. Giles Corey suffered for being ahead of his time. He denied the existence of witchcraft in a day when nearly everyone firmly believed in a personal devil with horns, hoofs, and tail. When the process of applying pressure commenced, Corey begged the officers to pile as much weight on as possible that his sufferings might the sooner be ended. Robert Califf, a liberal-minded merchant of Salem who did all in his power to stem the rising tide of madness during the witchcraft prosecutions, relates a horrifying incident of Giles Corey's death. In pressing, his tongue being pressed out of his mouth, the sheriff, with his cane, forced it back again while he was dying. Martha Corey was hanged on Gallows Hill, Salem, September 22nd, 1692, 3 days after her aged husband suffered the cruelest death ever imposed by a civilized man on the North American continent. An old ballad written in the contemporary style tells of Giles Corey's death in these quaint words. Giles Corey was a wizard strong, a stubborn wretch was he, and fit was he to hang on high upon ye locust tree. So when before ye magistrates for trial he did come, he would no true confession make, but was completely dumb. Giles Corey, saith ye magistrate, what hast thou here to plead to these that now accuse thy soul of crimes and horrid deed? Giles Corey, he saith not a word, no single word spake he. Giles Corey, saith ye magistrate, will press it out of thee. They got them then a heavy beam, they laid it on his breast, they loaded it with heavy stones, and hard upon him pressed. More weight, now said this wretched man, more weight, again he cried, and he would no confession make, but wickedly he died. The third of Seabury Quinn's true tales of witchcraft, Rebecca Nurse, Saint of Salem, tells how a colonial court, in violation of the principle of trial by jury, sent a saintly old woman to the gallows on the testimony of hysterical children. It will appear in Weird Tales next month. End of Section 2. Giles and Martha Corey. Section 3 of Servants of Satan by Seabury Quinn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Number 3. Rebecca Nurse, Saint of Salem. The frown of God lay black upon the province of Massachusetts in the spring of 1692. Harvests of the previous summer had been less bountiful than those of other years. Much livestock had died during the severe New England winter, and an expedition against the French in Canada had ended disastrously for the colonists. All these calamities, or any one of them, would have been enough to justify a day of solemn fasting and prayer for divine forgiveness. But terrible as the material misfortunes of the people were, they were as nothing compared to their spiritual torment. When crops failed and cattle died, it was understood as a sign of heavenly displeasure, and when the Frenchmen and their red-skinned allies withstood the trained bands of the New Englanders, the god of battles seemed to have withdrawn his favor. And when witchcraft, wild and rampant, spread like a plague throughout old Salem and its environs, the clergymen and elders of the church felt assured they were entirely forsaken by heaven. The Lord had turned his face from his people, and Satan, who laid cunning traps for the souls of the unwary, was working for the colonists' spiritual destruction, even as the French and Indians sought the destruction of their bodies. No man dared look his neighbor in the face for fear of seeing there the mark of Satan. Salem and Ipswich jails were full to bulging with confessed or suspected witches, and the group of young girls and women who seemed particularly susceptible to malign influences was constantly augmented by new recruits. Children and girls who fell into fits cried aloud in terror at invisible phantoms which mocked them from the air, or fell writhing to the floor, tortured by invisible fingers which pinched them black and blue, or thrust pins and needles into their tender flesh, till the red blood spurted from their wounds, staining their clothing and terrifying the beholders. The devil was loose. Everywhere he added to the number of his servants. Soon the entire settlement would lie beneath his dreadful domination. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, poor and friendless old women of Salem village, had been denounced as witches and thrown into jail. Tituba, the half-breed slave of the Reverend Samuel Parris, pastor of Salem Village Church, had confessed herself a witch and been sent to Boston to be sold to another master. Giles and Martha Corey, substantial farmer folk dwelling in Salem Farms, where the town of North Peabody now stands, had been cried out against by the afflicted children and lay in jail awaiting execution. Still the tide of deviltry ran higher and higher. The children continued to denounce first one then another of the neighbors as witches, for it seemed no sooner was one witch apprehended and lodged in prison than a dozen more arose to plague the people with the magic powers derived from Satan in return for their souls. Cotton Mather, doctor of divinity and eminent Boston preacher, had come to Salem to reinforce the Reverend Mr. Parris in his combat with the evil one, and the force of his sermons stirred the terrorized people to a fever pitch. Not one servant of Satan, not one brand out of hell's fire was to be allowed to remain in the midst of the congregation of the righteous. "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," commanded Holy Scripture. Witches and wizards, be they poor, friendless old women, prosperous farmers, or substantial citizens of Salem itself, must be gathered into the meshes of the law's net, and dealt with according to the dictates of Scripture. And now a shiver of surprise and incredulity ran through the dwellers of Salem village. Rebecca Nurse, widely known and universally loved wife of Francis Nurse of Salem, had been denounced as a witch by the afflicted children. The farmstead on which the Nurses dwelt had been divided into parcels, Francis and Rebecca Nurse retaining the original home, while such of their 8 children as had married occupied smaller plots adjacent. The family, while not the richest in Salem, was one of the most highly respected and most contented in the neighborhood. Mrs. Nurse herself was a veritable mother in Israel. Nearly every person in Salem was beholden to her in some manner, for she had watched beside their beds of birth and death, nursed them in sickness, and comforted them in sorrow. No one had ever applied to her in vain for aid. No beggar had ever been turned hungry from her door. Her 71 years of life represented 71 years of blamelessness. March 23, 1692, a warrant for her arrest was given George Herrick, Marshal of Essex County, and she was brought before the magistrates to answer a charge of working certain detestable acts called witchcrafts upon Ann Putnam, Mary Walcott, Elizabeth Hubbard, and Abigail Williams. Ann Putnam, a child of 12 years, was one of the afflicted children who had accused Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne of witchcraft. She was also the original accuser of Martha and Giles Corey of Salem Farms. Abigail Williams was a niece of the Reverend Mr. Parris and a member of his household. Together with the Putnam child, she had been a prosecuting witness in every trial for witchcraft in Salem village. When Rebecca Nurse stood before Magistrate Hawthorne to answer the charges brought against her by the children, there were many in the courtroom who felt a grievous error had been made. That saintly old goodwife Nurse should be suspected of witchcraft, of trafficking with Satan, was as unthinkable almost as a similar charge against Mr. Parris or even the learned Dr. Mather would have been. Yet Magistrate Hawthorne proceeded in the same hectoring manner he had used toward all suspects in witchcraft cases, asking the prisoner repeatedly not whether, but why she had injured the prosecuting children. At last, desperate, the old lady extended her hands toward heaven, exclaiming, "I have none to appeal to but God." At this, all the afflicted showed every evidence of undergoing violent pains, their screams and howls drowning out the words of the accused. Hawthorne determined to remand the prisoner to jail, and the old lady bowed her white head in meek resignation. Immediately, the afflicted children were forced to bend their heads forward, nor could they raise them till, at Abigail Williams' entreaty, the marshal roughly forced Mrs. Nurse's head up, whereupon, according to a note made by Mr. Parris, it was observed that Betty Hubbard, her head was immediately righted. June 2nd, 1692, Rebecca Nurse's trial for certain detestable acts called witchcrafts commenced. The Reverend Samuel Parris, pastor of Salem Village Church, acted as assistant prosecuting attorney, clerk of court, and general factotum. The first witness examined by Mr. Parris was the child, Ann Putnam, who swore, "I was grievously tortured by her during her examination," before Magistrate Hawthorne in March, "and also during the time of her examination I saw the apparition," i.e. a supernatural specter or demon duplicate of the accused, which emanated from or returned to her body at will, "of Rebecca Nurse go and hurt the bodies of Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, Elizabeth Hubbard, and Abigail Williams." This deposition we have in the handwriting of Mr. Parris, but whether he wrote it after Anne's testimony or jotted it down as she delivered her evidence, there is no way of telling. At any rate, we find another note, also in the hand of the Reverend Prosecutor, which states, to the same effect were the statements of Mary Walcott, Elizabeth Hubbard, and Abigail Williams. One of the beliefs of the time was that Satan set his seal upon all his servants, that witches and wizards were all branded with the devil's mark. For this reason, it was customary for the court to appoint a jury of the same sex as the accused to make a minute physical examination and report any unusual warts, moles, or growths found upon his or her body. It was thought that the evil one assigned one of his imps to the special service of each of his human servants, the imp assuming the shape of a black cat, an owl, a rat, or some other uncanny-looking creature, and performing such supernatural errands as the witch chose to order. For nourishment, the imp, or familiar, as it was termed, sucked the witch's blood, and the spot from which the blood was drawn became insensible to pain. This spot was popularly known as a witch test. Now it often happens that old persons grow certain excrescences of the flesh not found upon the bodies of younger people, yet these are perfectly explainable by natural causes. Such a growth was found upon the body of Rebecca Nurse by the jury of women appointed to inspect her person, and though 2 of the jurywomen reported it to be of a natural origin, the verdict of the committee as a whole was that the prisoner had been marked by Satan. June 28th, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty. Thereupon, Mr. Parris records in his notes, there was much anguish among the afflicted. The girls, whose testimony under the skillful questions of the Reverend Samuel Parris had charged Rebecca Nurse with being in league with the devil, rolled upon the floor, shrieking and crying, frothing at the mouth, and otherwise giving evidence of unsupportable suffering. Then came the crowning infamy of this infamous proceeding. The judges refused to entertain a verdict favorable to the prisoner. Solemnly they rose and directed the jury to retire and reconsider their verdict. The jurymen filed from the courtroom, debated some time, and returned to state they could not arrive at a verdict other than that already given. The court thereupon ordered them to bring in a verdict of guilty as charged against the accused, which monstrous order was complied with by the overawed jurymen. It must be remembered that persons accused of felony were not allowed the services of attorneys for their defense under the English law of those days, but to compensate for this handicap, the judges were supposed to conserve the prisoner's legal rights in every way. This was their sworn duty, and according to law and to the judge's oath, every reasonable doubt was bound to be resolved in the prisoner's favor. By their action in the case of Rebecca Nurse, then, her judges violated their duty and their sacred oaths as judicial officers, staining their hands with the innocent blood and their reputations with infamy for all time. Such a villainous perversion of justice was never before or since committed in an English-speaking court on the North American continent. Sentence of death by hanging was passed upon Rebecca Nurse, but 39 of the most prominent and respected persons in the community signed a statement declaring, "We never had any cause or grounds to suspect her of such a thing as she is now accused of," and Sir William Phips, Royal Governor of Massachusetts, granted her a reprieve. Heretofore, all power to do harm had automatically departed from witches and wizards once they were safely under lock and key. But Rebecca Nurse appears to have been an exceptionally powerful evildoer, for no sooner had the governor's reprieve been served on the Salem authorities than the children whose testimony had sworn her life away became afflicted as never before. Abigail Williams, the Reverend Mr. Parris's niece, was especially marked by her sufferings and had her seizures in the most public places. The sight of her torments was too much for the neighbors. Representations were made to the governor by certain gentlemen of Salem, and the reprieve was withdrawn. Rebecca Nurse was hanged on Gallows Hill, July 19, 1692. In the dead of night, her family crept stealthily to the unmarked grave into which her body had been tumbled by the hangman, exhumed her remains, and buried them in the family graveyard. No clergyman was present to read his office over her, for she had been excommunicated by the Reverend Mr. Parris, but her aged and sorrowing husband read from the Scripture such passages of love and forgiveness as seldom are heard from ordained clergymen of the fundamentalist school, and tears of grief watered the grave where the faithful wife and mother was laid beside her dear ones gone before. If meekness and forgiveness of those who despitefully entreat one accused falsely, and resignation to an unjust and undeserved fate constitute the essentials of a saint's character, then Salem, Massachusetts, is as surely entitled to claim golden-hearted Rebecca Nurse as its patron saint as any cathedral town of France or Flanders may claim patronage from some martyr who tasted death for the faith that was in him. Note: Number 4 of this series will treat the persecution, trial, and execution of the Reverend George Burroughs, one-time pastor of Salem Village Church. End of number 3. Rebecca Nurse, Saint of Salem. Section 4 of Servants of Satan by Seabury Quinn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Number 4. George Burroughs, Martyr. In one of his terror tales, Poe tells how the inmates of a lunatic asylum overcame their keepers, locked them in the cells, and proceeded to administer the affairs of the institution according to the dictates of their own diseased minds. Something like this situation, magnified many times, prevailed in the village of Salem, Massachusetts, in the summer and autumn of 1692. In the spring, a number of young women and girls, mostly members of respected and influential families, began acting in a way which would have led to an inquiry concerning their sanity half a century later, but which induced the authorities of that day to declare them the victims of witchcraft. Encouraged by the Reverend Samuel Parris, pastor of Salem Village Church, and by the magistrates of the district, these afflicted children accused 2 poor friendless old women, then a prosperous farmer and his wife, next a universally respected and revered old lady, of the diabolical crime of witchcraft. And in every instance, the accused suffered death. Absolute power was lodged in the hands of this group of hysterical girls by the credulous public officials. No juvenile despot of antiquity, not even the Queen in Alice in Wonderland, with her customary order, "Off with his head," ever exercised greater authority over the lives and liberties of a community than this company of young women, the oldest of whom was 20 years of age. Those first accused were residents of Salem and its environs, people whom the afflicted saw daily. In March 1692, however, came the first long-distance accusations when the Reverend George Burroughs, residing in Wells in the province of Maine, was cried out upon by the afflicted children. Mr. Burroughs was a man of more than ordinary physique, and much more than ordinary character. Short of stature, he was abnormally strong, and combined with great physical strength and a nature of unusual sweetness and charity. Prior to the Reverend Samuel Parris's accession to the Salem pastorate, Burroughs occupied the pulpit, but, unlike most clergymen of his day, he dwelt more upon the love of God than upon his awful wrath, and the iron-souled members of Salem congregation released him in favor of a preacher of sterner doctrine. Incidentally, they allowed him to depart with a considerable portion of his salary unpaid. Evil fortune seemed to dog Mr. Burroughs' steps. While he was in Salem, his wife died. He remarried shortly after taking up his work in another parish, and his second mate also died. Discouraged, all but despairing, he quit the colony of Massachusetts to take up missionary work in Maine. On April 10th, 1692, one John Partridge, a marshal of the latter province, arrested him on a warrant charging witchcraft, trafficking with the evil one, and sundry other diabolical crimes. May 4th he was returned to Salem village to answer the accusation. The Reverend Samuel Parris, who acted as clerk of court and assistant prosecutor in this case, as well as others, leaves us this quaint notation of Mr. Burroughs' examination. At his entry into the courtroom, many, if not all of the bewitched, were grievously tortured. Susan Sheldon testified that Burroughs, his 2 wives, appeared in their winding sheets and said that man had killed them. He was bid to look upon Susan Sheldon. He looked back and knocked down all or most of the afflicted who stood behind him. Mercy Lewis's deposition going to be read, and he looked at her, and she fell into a dreadful and tedious fit. Mary Walcott, Elizabeth Hubbard, Susan Sheldon, testimony going to be read, and they all fell into fits. The magistrates, as was usual in these cases, attempted to bully the accused into an admission of guilt, asking him again and again if it were not a fact that his house in Maine was haunted by the ghosts of his 2 murdered wives. The officials appear to have taken it for granted that he had murdered his wives, for had not their shades appeared to the afflicted children, and had not these very children sworn away the lives of half a dozen other persons? Mr. Parris notes that the accused clergyman stoutly denied his house was haunted by ghosts, either of his wives or others, but adds with an air of triumph that he admitted there were toads in his garden. Among other proofs that George Burroughs was a servant of Satan, the following facts were testified to. he had been seen to lift a barrel of molasses in his arms and carry it. He had been seen to carry a barrel of cider in his arms. He had been seen to pick up a musket by the muzzle and hold it out at arm's length. When he explained that God had been pleased to endow him with more than usual strength, the afflicted children were one and all grievously vexed, falling in fits upon the courtroom floor and screaming and crying till the proceedings had to be halted. No witchcraft trial was complete without testimony from that remarkable 12-year-old child, Ann Putnam. It was on her testimony that Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne were condemned to death. Giles Corey of Salem Farms was arrested on her accusation. So was his wife, Martha Corey. Rebecca Nurse, loved and respected by nearly every dweller in Salem, received sentence of death by hanging largely on Ann's testimony. Whenever other witnesses were wanting to bear conclusive proof against a suspected witch, Ann Putnam could be depended on to furnish the necessary testimony. Consequently, we find this child being duly sworn upon the Holy Scriptures to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and testifying that Burroughs had appeared to her one night and told her he had 3 wives and had butchered the first 2 to death. Subsequently, she swore, the shade of Mr. Burroughs suddenly appeared in her bedroom at dead of night, bringing along the ghosts of his 2 deceased wives as corroborative witnesses. They had turned their faces toward him and looked very red and angry, telling him he had been a very cruel man to them and that they should be clothed with white robes in heaven when he should be cast into hell. How typical this statement is of an imaginative child, fed from earliest infancy on ghost tales and the flint-hard doctrine of Knox and Calvin. Even the briefest survey of the Burroughs case discloses the keenest competition among the juvenile witnesses as to who could tell the most outrageously fanciful tale. Take, for example, this statement of Mercy Lewis, as recorded by the Reverend Mr. Parris. On the night of May 9th, Burroughs carried me up to a high mountain and showed me all the kingdoms of the earth, and told me he would give them all to me if I would write in his book, and if I would not, he would throw me down and break my neck. I told him I would not write in his book if he threw me down on 100 pitchforks. Leaving out of consideration the fact that there is no high mountain near Salem, the modern reader may be puzzled to know how Mr. Burroughs, who was then lodged under double lock in Salem jail, could get out to convey the girl to the mountain top, how he could manage to disclose all the kingdoms of the earth to her from the eminence, and especially how he, a poor, obscure colonial preacher with most of his pitifully small salary still owed to him by his former congregation, could deliver her so much wealth. Also, it may be wondered why he did not attempt to make good his threat to break her neck when his munificent offer was refused. But these questions seem not to have worried the court, for the child's preposterous story was received with all due gravity and made a part of the judicial record. The book referred to by the Lewis girl was, of course, the Devil's Black Book. In it were inscribed the names of all those who acknowledged themselves Satan's servants. By this acknowledgment they agreed to give the fiend their souls after death, and in return were granted certain supernatural powers which usually manifested themselves as ability to make neighbors stock, sicken, and die, cream refuse to churn into butter, and hens fail to lay their customary number of eggs. A moment's reflection, it would seem, should have warned the person intending to sign away his soul that the devil was getting decidedly the best of the bargain. One other statement which sheds an interesting light on the public mind in 1692 appears in the records of this case. It is that of Abigail Williams, niece of the Reverend Samuel Parris and member of his household. It was not made in court, nor was it sworn to, yet it was duly received and preserved as a part of the court's record. Some time before Mr. Burroughs was brought back to Salem to stand trial, while he was still 100 miles or so away in Maine, Abigail met Benjamin Hutchinson in the street and suddenly declared she saw Burroughs. "Where?" demanded Hutchinson, for naturally he saw no one. "There," replied the child, pointing excitedly to a rut in the road. Hutchinson was carrying a pitchfork over his shoulder, and to pacify her he flung the implement at the spot where she declared the clergyman stood. Thereupon as was characteristic of the afflicted children, Abigail Williams fell to the earth in a fit. After lying rigid in the roadway a few minutes, she rose with a shudder, exclaiming, "You've torn his coat, I heard it rip." "Whereabouts?" Hutchinson asked. "On the side," she replied. "Do not you see the great rent in his garment?" Naturally, Hutchinson saw no such thing and said so. A little later the same day, Hutchinson met the child in the house of Lieutenant Ingersoll, and she at once manifested every symptom of ungovernable terror, crying, "There he stands! Do you not see him there in the corner?" The man, now thoroughly convinced the girl really saw some supernatural visitant, advanced upon the shadowy corner of the room, drawing his sword as he walked. But before he had gone 4 paces, Abigail shrieked, "He is gone, but there stands a gray cat in his place." At that, Hutchinson struck his rapier through the empty air where the phantom cat was supposed to be crouching, and, in the words of the record, thereupon she fell into a fit, and when it was over, she said, "You killed her." Now, mark how ingeniously this shameless little impostor played upon the superstitious credulity of the man. Half unwilling to be beguiled by her words, yet half fearful she really had seen some evidence of witchcraft, Hutchinson protested he saw no cat's carcass on the floor, but the little maid replied, "Oh, the shade of Sarah Good came and carried her away." Sarah Good was one of the poor old women who waited execution by hanging in Ipswich jail at the time, and her conviction had been procured largely on the testimony of Abigail Williams and Ann Putnam. Though she had probably never heard the word, Abigail Williams was a shrewd, practical psychologist. Having prepared Hutchinson's superstitious mind by her imposing cries and fainting fits, she chose this moment to strengthen the already impregnable case which popular ignorance and credulity had made against poor, friendless old Sarah Good. The jury impaneled to try George Burroughs gave little time to consider their verdict. He was found guilty as charged, and sentenced to be hanged on Gallows Hill, August 19, 1692. One of the current superstitions was that persons who had really sold their souls to Satan could not repeat the Lord's Prayer correctly. But at the gibbet's foot, George Burroughs recited the beautiful petition from beginning to end with great fervor and beauty, and quoted from the book of Job, "I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that he shall stand at the latter day upon the earth, and though after my skin worms destroy this body, yet in my flesh shall I see God." The afflicted children, who had gathered on Gallows Hill to see their victim die, attempted to drown out the sound of his words by shrieking that a great black man stood at his shoulder, dictating the prayer and scriptural passages to him. Townsmen of Salem, assembled to see Satan's servant pay the price of his wickedness, were thunderstruck when they heard the holy words fall from the convicted wizard's lips. "This man is no witch," a murmur ran through the crowd. "Save him! Stop the execution! We commit murder!" The people pressed forward to take the condemned preacher from the hangman. But the Reverend Dr. Cotton Mather, who was also present to witness the execution, spurred his horse between the victim and his would-be rescuers. He preached a fiery sermon from the saddle, reminding the people that the devil could quote Scripture for his purposes, and declaring this was but a cunning artifice of the evil one to save his servant. Meanwhile, the hangman had adjusted the noose about the prisoner's throat, the platform was snatched away, and George Burroughs' stainless soul ascended to its endless home as his martyred body swung between earth and sky. A contemporary resident of Salem Village, writing of the execution to a friend in Boston, described the last chapter of the Reverend George Burroughs' tragedy in these words. "When he had been cut down, he was dragged by the halter to a hole or grave between the rocks about 2 feet deep, his shirt and breeches being pulled off, and an old pair of trousers of one previously executed put on his lower parts. He was so put in that one of his hands and his chin was left uncovered. So Christians did unto Christians in the name of their common religion in the year of grace, 1692. And Where Tales next month, Seabury Quinn tells of the end of the New England witchcraft horror and narrates how, when more than 200 witches were lying in the jails of Salem and Ipswich, awaiting death at the hands of the common hangman, Governor Phipps of Massachusetts suddenly ended the persecution and emptied the jails. The Puritan series will be followed by a thrilling true tale of witchcraft from medieval Germany, told in Mr. Quinn's most fascinating style. End of number 4. George Burroughs, Martyr. Section 5 of Servants of Satan by Seabury Quinn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Ben Tucker. Number 5. The End of the Horror. In the village church of Salem, Massachusetts, one summer afternoon in the year 1692, Mary Easty, wife of Isaac Easty, of Salem Village, stood to receive sentence of death by hanging. "Mary Easty," said Chief Justice Stoughton, "you have been tried by a jury of your peers and found guilty of the horrible and detestable crime of witchcraft. Mary Easty, have you anything to say why sentence of death should not be passed upon you?" The prisoner regarded her judges calmly. She was a fragile woman, about 58 years of age, borne down by years of heartbreaking toil, by long imprisonment, and the fear of death which had been with her since the day the marshal took her in custody. She had borne 7 children to Massachusetts, sons and daughters, whose descendants would one day sustain the rights of Englishmen by taking up arms against England's German king. She had always endeavored to live in love and charity with her neighbors. Now she stood convicted of the most terrible crime known to the law, a crime worse than treason itself. She curtsied to the court, as a well-behaved woman should to her betters. "Your honors," said she, "I humbly petition you, not for my own life, for I know I must die, and my appointed time is set. But if it be possible, let no more innocent blood be shed." Mary Easty was the sister of Rebecca Nurse, already convicted of witchcraft, and, like her sister, she had been found guilty on the testimony of Ann Putnam and Abigail Williams, both children in their teens, who declared on oath that her shade had come to them in the night and sorely afflicted them. On September 22nd, Mary Easty and 7 other unfortunates, all condemned on the testimony of the afflicted children, were conveyed to Gallows Hill and hanged by the neck until dead. The Reverend Mr. Noyes, duly ordained clergyman and friend and confidant of Samuel Parris, pastor of Salem Village Church, looked at the bodies swinging from the gallows and piously remarked, "How sad it is to see 8 firebrands of hell hanging there." It was the last time the reverend gentleman's churchly eyes were to be saddened by such a spectacle. Encouraged by their minister, the Reverend Samuel Parris, the group of girls had sworn away life after life during the long summer of 1692. No one, no matter how good his reputation, was safe if once these irresponsible children cried out against him. Giles and Martha Corey, well-to-do and respectable farmers, had been put to death on their testimony. Rebecca Nurse, dearly loved for her piety and goodness, had died a felon's death. Even George Burroughs, an ordained minister of the gospel, widely loved and wholesomely respected, had not been safe against their malice. And once a person stood accused by these pitiless little wretches, his doom was sealed. No alibi could be pleaded, for the essence of the case in almost every instance was that the accused had appeared unto and grievously afflicted one or more of the accusing children when he, the accused, was well known to be somewhere else. Absurd? Of course it is, by any process of modern reasoning, but the whole belief in witchcraft was based on a wholehearted acceptance of the existence of a personal devil. The fiend bought the souls of such as would acknowledge themselves his servants, and as purchase price gave them an attendant imp or familiar. When Satan's servant wished to plague some godly soul, all she had to do was summon her familiar and bid it assume an exact likeness of herself. Then, while the familiar, in the witch's shape, carried on her regular vocations, the witch bestrode her broomstick and hied away on her diabolical errand. Granting the truth of these premises, it will at once be seen that the most ironclad alibi proved by the accused served only to strengthen the case against her. Salem and its environs had been thoroughly combed by the afflicted children in their accusations. Beginning with Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, two friendless old women, they had gradually worked up the social scale in search of victims, till at last a clergyman's life had paid the price of their perjury. Their power was absolute. On all sides they were flattered and deferred to as if they had been royalty, for their unsupported accusation was enough to seal the doom of anyone they chose to cry out against. Martha Corey, it was generally understood, had been cried out against because she had declared the afflicted were more in need of a sound thrashing than any other treatment. But like a well-written stage play, the tragedy which marred New England's colonial history came to an abrupt end at the very height of its horror. Increase Mather, president of Harvard College and father of Cotton Mather, had all along entertained grave doubts of the competence of the spectre evidence upon which so many persons had been condemned. He ventured to voice these misgivings in a public address, and the afflicted children cried out against him. Now, it was one thing for the humble pastor of a village church to be accused by these children of farmers and tradespeople, but quite another for the foremost divine and philosopher of a community which even then was the intellectual center of America to be made the target of their malice. Even so, their accusation might have proved embarrassing to Dr. Mather, if their overweening pride in their powers of destruction had not led them to shoot at the highest mark available in the colony. May 14, 1692, William Phipps had returned from London to Massachusetts with the King's commission as royal governor of the colony and an order of knighthood. He was an energetic, hard-headed Yankee, born of obscure parents at Monswig, Maine, apprenticed to a shipwright as a lad, and successful as only those of marked ability can be. From journeyman shipwright he had graduated to command of a small merchant vessel, later held a command in the Royal Navy, still later amassed a considerable fortune for himself and turned in a handsome profit to the crown by salvaging treasure from Spain galleons sunk in battle with the buccaneers of the Caribbean. Sir William had acquired considerable polish in his upward climb, but his wife, whom he had married during his days as journeyman and laborer, retained the plain thought and plainer speech of her early station in life. When news of the witch trials came to Boston, especially when the affecting scene attending the execution of the Reverend George Burroughs was related to her, she expressed her sentiments in no uncertain terms. Her remarks concerning the afflicted children had a Shakespearean, if not a Chaucerian, directness. This blow to the children's dignity was not to be tolerated. They, who had held absolute power of life and death in their immature hands for upwards of a year, whose lightest word spelled unescapable doom, were not to be spoken of thus, not by the royal governor's wife herself. One and all, the afflicted children became afflicted as never before. The fainting fits and wild cries and writhing convulsions they had displayed while being afflicted by other witches were as nothing to those they now exhibited almost constantly. And each seizure was so accompanied by the most heart-rending prayers for help from the wicked Lady Phipps, who thus sorely beset them. The sight of their sufferings would have wrung tears from a heart of stone. The sound of their tortured cries sent cold chills down the spines of every dweller in Salem village. Surely some servant of Satan, more powerful than all the rest combined, had taken them in her wicked power. The town was in an uproar. Sir William Phipps was a product of his times. Though possessing more than ordinary energy and ability, he suffered the timidity which went with the gross superstition of his day. But he had been married long enough to learn that a determined wife, like a force of nature, is not to be argued with. There is no record of the words Lady Phipps used to convince her lord and master, but there is a very definite record that he was convinced. An order from the royal governor of Massachusetts dissolved the special court which had tried and hanged 19 innocent persons in 10 months, and put another to death by the most barbarous means ever employed by white men in America. A second order, following hard upon the first, opened the jails where nearly 200 hapless wretches awaited the hangmen, and witch trials with all their horrors disappeared from Massachusetts forthwith. Only the grisly memory of them lingered like the memory of a frightful dream when the night was done. Years later, Anne Putnam made public confession that the accusations she had brought against the witches were false in every detail. She asserted she had been deluded by Satan to perjure herself and swear away the lives of her neighbors. And so great was the belief in the powers of the devil that the congregation of Salem Church accepted her excuse and forgave her, in word if not in deed. She died of tuberculosis while still a young woman, unmarried and unloved, but apparently not regarded with any special hatred by the relatives of those her lying testimony had sent to death. There appears no record of similar confessions by the other afflicted children. Perhaps their moral courage was not so great as that which led the Putnam girl to acknowledge her fault, even though she placed the greater part of the blame upon the devil. It would be pleasing to record that the Reverend Samuel Parris, whose desire to retain his pastorate began the terrible persecutions, suffered a fate befitting his crime. It does not appear that he did. In 1696, he was ousted from the pulpit of Salem Village Church on petition of several members of the congregation, among them John Tarbell and Samuel Nurse, both of whom had been bereaved through the judicial murders in which Mr. Parris had assisted 4 years before. But he left the parish with a handsome cash settlement and continued in the ministry for several more years, always quarreling with his congregations and always getting the better of the controversies. Note: Number 6 of this series, Maria Schweidler, is a thrilling true tale of witchcraft from Germany in the time of the 30 Years' War. It will appear in Weird Tales next month. End of number 5. The end of the horror. Section 6 of Servants of Satan by Seabury Quinn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Number 6. Maria Schweidler. The village of Cosroe drowsed indolently in the May sunshine. A breathing spell had come in the war which had racked all Germany for a generation. Wallenstein, the adventurer general of the Emperor Ferdinand's armies, had failed to make good his blasphemous boast that he would take the town of Stralsund, though it were fastened by chains to God's own throne, and Gustavus Adolphus, the Lion of the North, had swept the imperial troops from Pomerania. Suddenly the noonday calm was rent by such a clangor of bells as had not been heard since the alarm heralded the approach of Pappenheim's Walloons. Women rushed to their doors with infants clinging to their breasts, and older children clutching their skirts. Boys ceased their games in the streets. Men looked fearfully about, uncertain whether to rush indoors and arm or take incontinently to the woods. "Pish!" laughed a huntsman in a coat of green stuff decorated with gold lace. "Calm your fears, silly ones! 'Tis but the signal for a wolf hunt." He stuck his tongue in his cheek as he let fall the latest gossip from the castle. 3 weeks before, the Count Wittich, Graf of the district, had followed a fisherman's daughter into a coppice of fir trees. Those who knew the Count best could testify his favors never aided a maid to gain a husband, and it had gone hard for the pretty fisher's daughter if 2 great wolves, one of them with a single glaring eye, had not burst from the underbrush and chased his noble worship up the nearest tree. Returning good for evil, the little maid had hastened to the castle and raised the alarm, so the Count was rescued from his undignified perch before nightfall. But though his skin was untouched, his vanity was riddled, and he had sworn by all the Catholic and Protestant saints and martyrs indiscriminately that he would exterminate every wolf in the district, though the devil himself took them under his special protection. Wolf hunts had immediately been organized, and 4 of the beasts fell into the huntsman's nets. but no one-eyed brute could be found, either in field or thicket or forest, and Graf Wittich had sworn to kill the wolf, which cheated him of his flirtation with the fisherman's child. This much the huntsman told with a loud guffaw at his master's discomfiture, then abruptly set spurs to his horse and galloped away, for Graf Wittich Appleman himself, accompanied by no less persons than the sheriff and high constable of the district, came thundering down the village street, bawling aloud for the village folk to arm themselves and join the hunt without delay. As the cavalcade of gentry clattered past the village parsonage, a young girl came to the door, looking with interest at their splendid raiment, their tossing plumes and their flashing gorgets and swords. "Ach, Wittich!" the sheriff exclaimed, nodding toward the parson's daughter. "'Tis a pretty wench we have here. Methinks there may be better sport than hunting wolves in Khosrow." "Body of Judas!" the Graf answered testily. "Take her and be damned to you. If so be I can but kill me these pestilent wolves. You may have half the maidens, if indeed there be any such in the countryside. I've come to hunt wolves, not women." So, chuckled the sheriff, reining in his horse. "Do you hunt your wolves, mynheer? As for me, we shall see what we shall see." He removed his feathered hat and bowed to the girl. "Good morrow, pretty one," he greeted. "Wouldst care to enter the service of the Count?" "He did but now inform me there's a situation open at the castle." "I thank you, sir," the maiden answered as she dropped a demure curtsy. "But I have no wish to leave my father's home. My mother is dead, and I keep the house." "Ah, so," the sheriff answered musingly. "A little housefrau, eh? That is good, that is very good." He bowed again to the girl, as though she had been of the quality instead of only one step above the peasantry, smiled softly to himself, and remounted his horse. Maria Schweidler stood in her father's door and watched the man who was to bring so much sorrow into her life gallop after his companions. She was in truth a pretty thing, as the sheriff had remarked. Her hair was fair, with the rich, burnished metal sheen the ripened wheat stalks have at harvest time, and her skin was white with soft, creamy whiteness, which many a fine lady might have envied. Eyes blue as the cornflowers that dot the fields when the grain is ripe for cutting, looked out upon the world with a trusting frankness which told the beholder her spirit was as pure and virginal as her slim young body. For 7 of her 16 years she had ruled her widowed father's home, the pastor Abraham Schweidler, having lost his spouse in one of the periodical outbreaks of plague which afflicted the war-torn country. And though she could read the scriptures in their original Greek and Hebrew, her knowledge of the world was as scant as that of a 6-year-old child. Such was Maria Schweidler, daughter of the pastor of Khosrow, whose sweet young face had attracted the notice of the dissolute sheriff. The sheriff joined his friends. The hunt went merrily on, and in due time the one-eyed wolf was surrounded by the Count's dogs and captured. Graf Wittich and his 2 friends had rare sport blinding the poor brute's remaining eye and torturing him to death. They flayed him, and with pieces of his pelt fixed to their spears like banners, rode back to the castle and went to bed as befitted gentlemen of their station. Drunk. On the following Sunday after service, Johannes Kust, the Count's chief huntsman, appeared at the parsonage door and made formal request for Maria's hand in marriage, seeming not too greatly downcast when the old pastor peremptorily refused his suit. Perhaps the reverend gentleman would have regarded the Count's servant more favorably as a prospective son-in-law, had it not been for young Rudiger von Neinkirchen, son of the powerful Baron Hans von Neinkirchen, whose castle stood near Gutzkau, and who would one day be one of the country's greatest land proprietors in his own right. This young man had met the Schweidlers while they were on their way to the Gutzkau horse fair, and found it convenient to call frequently at the parsonage for discussions on theological doctrine with the pastor, and on less abstruse matters with the pastor's pretty daughter. At any rate, the huntsman's suit was rejected, and young Rudiger lingered at the parsonage till May matured into June, when he was called to the bedside of his father, promising to return as soon as circumstances permitted. But though Maria started up expectantly at the sound of every horseman riding before her father's door, the days grew into weeks, and the weeks into months, with no word from her absent lover, no message even that he remembered her or his promises of undying affection. And now a new cause for gossip pushed the subject of the parson's forsaken daughter from the villagers' thoughts. The pig and cattle of the neighborhood began to sicken and die in the most mysterious manner. Epidemics of cholera had visited the vicinity before, and the peasants were familiar with the symptoms of that scourge of the livestock raiser. But these deaths were without explanation, seemingly without cause. Gradually, however, one circumstance began to be noticed, then whispered, finally, openly talked of. The cattle shed and pigsty, which had last been passed by Maria Schweidler, was the scene of the latest outbreak of the strange malady. Old Frau Sieden, wife of Heinrich Sieden, a tenant farmer of the Count's, was first to whisper the suspicion, and later to point out instance after instance of the girl's visits being followed by death among the stock. On July 12th, 1630, the High Constable, bosom friend of the Count and the Sheriff, appeared at the parsonage door and commanded Maria Schweidler to accompany him. "What for?" asked the startled girl. "That you will learn soon enough," the constable answered with a grin. "Aforetime you were too high and mighty to go to the castle. We shall see whether you will refuse now. Come." Accompanied by her aged father, the girl went to the castle, finding the sheriff in his insignia of office, and a court composed of 3 stern old clergymen awaiting her. "Why have your worship summoned my innocent child?" the father asked in a quavering voice as he and his daughter stood before the tribunal. "To inquire into certain matters of witchcraft which have been plaguing the good people of this district," answered the court's president. "Maria Schweidler, stand forth and declare whether you be a witch or no." "I, a witch?" the girl stammered in horrified surprise. "Surely your worship is pleased to jest. Never in all my life have I done aught that is condemned by the laws of God or man." "Say you so?" replied the president of the court. "Perhaps you will say otherwise when—" He motioned to the constable, who stood grinning at the fair prisoner's elbow. Germany of that day had a system of criminal administration which differed radically from that of other nations. In England and her colonies, persons accused of crime were first presented to a justice of the peace or special magistrate's court, confronted with their accusers, and given a chance to refute the accusations against them, if they could. They might not lawfully be compelled to testify against themselves, nor could they be tortured into confessing their guilt. German justice suffered from no such scruples for the defendant's protection. A preliminary hearing was held before an inferior court known as the Untersuchungsrichter, testimony of the accusers being taken at one session, that of the accused at another. The defendant did not know what testimony had been offered against him, or even who his accusers were, and if he were backward in acknowledging his guilt, the courts possessed means of persuading him. "Let her look upon the instruments," the justice ordered. "Perhaps her sinful tongue will be loosened at their sight." Beneath the floor of Pudgla Castle was a vault reached by a stairway of 130 steps. No window let the light of day into it. No openings communicated with the outside sunshine. In its dark recesses a tormented woman could shriek and shriek until her soul fled forth from her quivering flesh. Yet no one in the upper castle knew what went on beneath. It was to this dungeon that the constable led the trembling girl. By the light of torches fastened in wall links, he showed her the ladder on which stubborn persons were bound, while the thumbscrews were fastened to their hands, or the boots fitted to their legs, the rack by which a suspect's limbs were stretched until they dislocated at hip and shoulder. A table with an oblong opening in its top through which a spiked roller rose to rasp the flesh from the prisoner's bones as horseradish is grated from the root. Last of all, he clapped his hands to summon 2 old women from an inner chamber, and when they appeared with a seething kettle between them, he dipped a feather into its contents. The quill shriveled and writhed as he flung it upon the torture chamber's floor. "There's brimstone, the very fuel of hell's own fire, in that cauldron, girl," the constable told her. "Anon I'll pour it on that soft breast and those white limbs of yours. Your flesh will wither and burn, even as that feather. Say now whether you be a witch or no."
"No," cried the girl. "As God is my judge, I'm no more a witch than you are a wizard."
"Ah, so,"
replied the constable. He turned to the hags, who had brought in the kettle, and commanded, "Dress her for the bridal bed." The crones seized the girl and hustled her into the farther room, stripped her stark naked, let down her hair, and clothed her in a necklace, sleeveless garment, which reached barely to her knees. Then, lashing her wrists together so tightly that her hands turned blue and puffed with congested blood, they led her back to the constable.
"Come, stubborn witch,"
he exclaimed, winding his hand in her flowing golden hair.
"Show thyself to the court. Let them see what an impertinent sinner we have in our midst."
Unable to steady herself with her hands, forced to walk backwards by the bully, who tugged at her hair, half fainting for shame at the scantiness of her single garment, Maria Schweidler was dragged up the winding stairs and led before the court.
"Alas!"
the Chief Justice cried as he smote himself on the breast in token of his sorrow.
"She hardens her heart against our mercy. Was not the sight of the implements enough to loosen thy stubborn tongue, wretched girl? Must we proceed to the ultimate question? Look!"
He pointed to several rust-colored stains on her black smock.
"Those be the blood of others whose wilful tongues were oiled by torment. Cannot you profit by their sufferings? Are you in truth not a witch?"
"No," the girl answered, though her lips trembled so she could scarcely form the words of her denial. "I am no witch at all, but a sinless maid who craves your worship's mercy. And though you torture me 10 times over, I can only say the same."
"Enough!"
answered the Chief Justice as he rose and bowed to his associate justices.
"I hereby make known to this worshipful court that the question ordinary and the question extraordinary of the stubborn and blasphemous witch, Maria Schweidler, is about to begin, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost."
With this, he took up an hourglass in one hand, and gathering his ecclesiastical robes in the other, descended from the judge's dais. But he could not bear the steady, reproachful scrutiny of the prisoner's eyes. He lowered his own glance, and, so doing, missed his step and stumbled, letting the hourglass fall from his hand to the floor, where it shattered into a myriad fragments.
"See, see!" cried the judges and court attendants together. "She calls upon her master, the devil, to keep her in her hour of need. 'Twas the devil who threw down the glass."
Preceded by the judges, the prisoner was dragged by the hair to the torture vault, and bound securely on the ladder of torment.
"What first, your worships?"
asked the constable as he knotted the cords about her wrists and ankles.
"Thumbscrews," ordered the president.
2 clumsy iron instruments, somewhat similar in appearance to the braces with which cabinet makers hold a joint of wood in place while the glue is setting, were brought by the old women and adjusted to Maria's hands in such a way that pressure from their threaded screws would crush her finger joints as the handles were gradually tightened. As she felt the cold metal against her delicate flesh, the poor child turned her eyes upward toward the smoke-blackened vault of the torture chamber and cried in agony of spirit, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani." It may have been excitement and superstitious dread. Perhaps it was abysmal ignorance which prevented the reverend president of the court from recognizing the piteous quotation from the Gospel of St. Matthew. In any event, he cried out, "She calls upon her hellish master in a heathen tongue! Apply the screws!" As her bones bent beneath the pressure of the instruments of torture, Maria's spirit failed. "I confess, I confess!" she screamed wildly. "God forgive my weakness, I am a witch, a wicked witch! Do ye direct me what to say, worshipful judges, and I will say it only for gentle Mary's sake. Torment me no more, I beseech you." And then the humble and holy men of God commenced their examination of this innocent 16-year-old child, while the constable stood hard by, ready to turn the torturing thumbscrews if she faltered in her answers. Had she abjured God and all his holy saints, and bound herself by oath to Satan to be his servant forever and ever? Yes. Did she possess a familiar spirit which did her bidding and killed her Christian neighbors' pigs and cattle? Yes. Had Satan set his mark upon her? A pause. "Apply the screws, constable." Yes. Ah, mercy, your worships. See, here is the fiend's mark on my bosom." The black torture shift was slit with a knife at its upper helm, and between her breasts was found a tiny mole, scarce larger than the eye of a fine needle. "Proceed. The devil's mark is found." Had she lived with the devil? "No, your worships. I have never lived anywhere but in my father's house, save 2 nights we spent at the inn in Gutskow." "Trifle not with us, woman. You know what we mean. Have you lived with the fiend as his mistress? Apply the screws, constable. The witch grows stubborn." Mercy. Yes, I've been Satan's mistress. Oh, release me, sirs, release me. Forbear the torture. Oh. Water to bathe her brow was brought, and a cup of sour wine was forced between her lips. When she had revived, the court proceeded. "Have ye borne the fiend any imps? Apply the screws!" Yes. She had borne a brood of half-breed imps to her hellish paramour. "How many?" 3. "What were their names?" "They were nameless." "Enough. The Scarlet Woman has confessed her abominations. Unbind her and put her clothes upon her." The court which took testimony did not consider the evidence. Depositions of witnesses, including the confessions of the accused, were reduced to writing, and the whole record of the case referred to a central court for adjudication. The members of this tribunal read the testimony and applied the law to it, then certified their findings back to the court of original jurisdiction. Along with the examining judge's record of the testimony was sent a written argument in defense of the accused, if he had money enough to employ an advocate, for, though the accused himself was not allowed to hear the testimony against him, his lawyer was permitted as much time as he desired to peruse and digest the transcripts and pick the prosecution's case to pieces in his brief. Pastor Schweidler secured the services of a Latin-spouting pedantic clergyman in his daughter's defense, and this learned old dotard prepared a lengthy screed full of scriptural passages and highly moral precepts and quotations from the classics, but bearing not at all on the facts in Maria's case. In the meantime, too, Pastor Schweidler wrote a frantic appeal to young Rudiger von Neinkirchen, imploring his intercession and that of his august father in his unhappy child's cause. Just before the testimony was certified to the central court, a note came from Rudiger, saying that as Maria had seen fit to be untrue to her love vows, preferring to wanton with the devil rather than marry a Christian man, she might burn to death in earthly fire, and therefore burn forever in hellfire for all he cared. As it was in Salem in 1692, so it was in Germany in 1630. The result of the witch's case was foregone. The last of August 1630, Maria Schweidler was led into court to hear the Chief Justice pronounce, "We do hereby direct that the self-confessed witch, Maria Schweidler, be duly torn 4 times across each breast with red-hot pincers, and after that burned to death by fire. Given at the castle of Pudla, 30th August, 1630. As he announced her doom, the president of the court picked up a light willow wand and snapped it in 2 pieces, flinging the halves at the prisoner's feet. This was to signify that as the wood was broken in twain, so should her soul and body be separated from each other. Had the girl been found guilty of theft, murder, or any other crime meriting death, the sentence would have concluded with the pious wish, "And may God have mercy on her soul." But she had confessed to witchcraft under torture, so there was no hope for her on earth or yet in heaven. The tearing pincers and the crackling flames with which her young life was shortly to be ended were but the momentary prelude of the everlasting torture reserved for her by the merciful God who so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believed on him should not perish, but have everlasting life. There was no locus penitentiae, or opportunity for repentance, permitted the condemned witch under the German code. "What thou hast to do, do quickly," were the executioner's standing orders, and Maria was led from the courtroom to the cart which waited to carry her to the stake. The sheriff mounted his tall gray horse, the constable with his sword drawn lest the witch work Christian folk in injury, took his station in the cart beside the prisoner. And surrounded by a guard of the Graf's varlets, the girls set out for the spot where the faggots were already piled high about the stake, and the hideous old women heated the executioner's pincers white-hot in a charcoal furnace. Led by the sheriff, the little procession trotted down the unpaved roadway, clattered across the plank bridge above the mill stream, and brought up at the spot of execution. 100 yokels gathered in hang-jawed amazement to see a young girl mutilated and burned, set up a cheer as the cart horse, frightened by the fumes from the charcoal stove, pranced and reared on its hind legs, all but oversetting the cart in which the constable and his prisoner stood. The executioner seized the condemned and tore her bodice open, exposing her white breast to the gazing throng, then pulled on his heavy cowhide gloves and took up his red-hot tongs. "Hello! Hello! Stop!" The shout echoed faintly across the fields from the patch of forest land beneath the castle hill, and the notes of a hunter's horn sounding the view followed close upon it. Bent low above their horses' necks, riding like the good St. Hubert himself, came a party of 12 men in the maroon and silver liveries of the house of Nine-Kirken, the sunbeams playing bravely on the glistening tips of their boar spears. "Do your duty, headsman," cried the sheriff, as the Graf's justicer paused uncertainly at sight of the onrushing riders. "Do your duty. Carry out the sentence." And to the approaching huntsman the sheriff announced, "We do but put an impious witch to death, my lords." "Thou liest, dog and perjurer, and likewise thou diest with the lie in thy throat, or I am no son of Nine-Kirken," answered the foremost rider as he brought his spear to the charge and drove its razor-sharp head through the sheriff's breast. "Ho, some of you! Hold these swine in play!" he shouted as he leaped from his jaded horse, tore off his hunting coat, and threw it over the violated bosom of the trembling girl. "Now, God and all his saints be praised, my love, my only love, that we arrived in time," he panted, for he was spent with 3 hours' breakneck riding. And there, before the throng come forth to see Maria Schweidler die by fire, Rudiger von Nine-Kirken put his arms about the condemned witch and kissed her on the lips. "Ha! Villain! Wouldst thou?" He evaded the thrust the constable aimed at him, drew his short sword, and struck out with such berserk fury that his assailant went down upon the faggots with a gaping wound in his breast. "Mercy, mercy!" the constable besought as Rudiger would have slit his throat. "Have mercy, my lord, and I will tell all." It was a sorry tale the dying man sobbed out. Inflamed with passion, the sheriff had first conceived the scheme of luring Pastor Schweidler's daughter to the castle, where he could seduce her at his leisure. Failing that, he had sent Johannes Kust, the count's chief huntsman, to seek her in marriage, for therein lay a chance to gratify his lust lawfully. By the ancient law, the Graf might claim the privilege of occupying the bridal chamber of any of his vassals, or he might delegate the privilege to whom he chose. Had Maria consented to marriage with the huntsman, she would have been his wife in name only, actually the plaything of the lecherous count and his bestial friends. Her marriage would have been but the mask to cover her shame. But the hope of marriage to Rudiger had saved her from this infamy, and the sheriff, balked in his villainous scheme, had sought revenge by bribing old Frau Seaton to poison the peasants' pigs and cattle, then raised the cry of witchcraft against Maria. Rudiger's seeming forgetfulness was soon explained. Summoned to attend his father's supposed sickbed, he had been locked in the castle by the proud old baron and told he might stay there until he rotted if he would not agree to give up all thought of marriage with the humble village pastor's daughter. The heartless reply to the pastor's letter was written by the baron and signed with his son's name. Only the day before the old baron had died in his cups, and Rudiger, now Baron von Nine-Kirken, in his own right was released from his prison. Hearing of his beloved's plight only that morning, he had deserted his father's bier, summoned 11 of his stoutest retainers, and ridden as though pursued by all the fiends of pandemonium to effect her rescue. Maria's father performed the marriage ceremony in his own church, and Rudiger, Baron von Nine-Kirken, whose influence with the mighty Gustavus Adolphus was great, had little difficulty in securing a full pardon for the beautiful baroness. Such is the story of Maria Schweidler, together with a great many other facts of much less interest, records of births, christenings, marriages, and burials of unimportant folk. It is spread on the records of the parish of Khosrow, in the crabbed German script of her father, the Reverend Abraham Schweidler, who closes the romantic story of his daughter's trial and deliverance with these pious words: "Thus was my child delivered out of the hands of the oppressor by the Lord, yea, even by the Most High God. Amen." Note: this series of true tales of witchcraft began in the March issue of Weird Tales. The first 5 tales describe the horrors of the witchcraft craze in New England during the colonial period. Copies of the magazine will be sent to any address post-paid by the publishers for 25 cents a copy. End of number 6, Maria Schweidler. End of Servants of Satan by Seabury Quinn.